Hi there, my name's Isha Rupert and welcome to The Higher Life, where together we're navigating the great change that is currently taking place within humanity. Now, if you've been following me for a while, the focus here really is on unpacking different concepts, ideas, and tools that can empower your life. But why would you want to do this? And what does empowerment really mean? In today's episode, I want to cut to the core of the transformation that's happening right now and speak a little bit to the future human. And what is this evolving human consciousness that we are a part of? And what does it mean for how we are going to show up, relate, and be in the future world? You know, it's such an exciting vision to be exploring right now. Now, of course, I don't have the answers to exactly how humanity is going to look in 100 or 200 years' time. But what I can do is read systemically what's unfolding right now and really decipher what that intention might be. So what do I mean by this practically? Well, right now, if we observe ourselves and how we use our energy and personal agency in the world, it can give us a lot of intel into the beliefs that we hold as a species about the true nature of our power, our personal power, or the absence of it. And this comes down really to perception and how mature and spiritually aligned your perception is. There are parts of humanity which have a very immature relationship to their own power. And we see this playing out all over the world on the global stage. This idea that power is dominance, power is access to resources, power is having the right to decide what's going to happen on the behalf of others. And this is, of course, a form of power or a form of agency, but it's very limited. And if you've been following my episodes for a while, you'll know that in the last episode, I dug a little deeper into these three different psychologies: the psychology of the ego, the soul, and the spirit. And the power that I'm speaking to here is very much related to ego power, a socially conditioned or culturally conditioned version of power that we are educated into from the moment we are born. But there is, in fact, more authentic sources of power. So here at The Higher Life, the premise is that the future human will evolve out of work that we do in the present moment. And that work is about exploring what is the correct use of our energy as a single human being who is part of this larger relationship intelligence system called humanity. You know, we have energy. We are energy beings. And the way we focus and use our energy day to day actually co-creates and maintains our reality. And our cultural reality is only able to stay alive because we energize it through agreeing to participate in society according to a set of rules or beliefs. And, you know, this has just been reinforced from one generation to the next. However, if we also look at the continuity of humanity, we'll see that every generation also is part of an activation in which we become more conscious and aware of how we operate, and we tend to actually make adjustments. Now, in this time in history, one of the big adjustments that we're making is about how we relate, family systems. We are exploring addictions. We are exploring far more in depth the nature of our own potential. And you see that rhetoric and that dialogue happening in all types of conversations out again on the global stage. So we have this sort of parallel experience happening where there is a rise up of very egoic, ignorant leadership and power structures or power models. And that rising can seem very terrifying, let's just put it that way. It could really raise in us this idea that humanity is not evolving, and we're just replaying the same sorts of conflicts we've been doing for years and incurring the same sort of really heavy losses, not only physically to all the people who are suffering and who are dying, but also psychically and energetically, because that wounding that gets reinforced through every generation through these conflicts and wars weighs very heavy on the whole of humanity's psyche and emotional nature. So that should give us a clue as to what the future human will be born out of. And that will be redirecting the way that we use our energy day to day, and also coming to understand the true nature of our personal agency. Now, in current times, and that's sort of a symptom of a mindset that was cultivated decades, if not centuries ago, the belief is that the highest potential of a human being is something that we can express externally, either a talent, an idea, a vision, this, performance-driven environment that we're in. It's all based on this idea that our agency comes from being able to make change and have an impact out in the world, or to be able to force some kind of internal shift, and that really is, of course, a version of personal agency, but again, it is not our highest potential. And we have seen ourselves as a species maximizing that version of potential. And I have spoken to that many times over in previous episodes. There's only so many Olympics that you can run. We've been to the moon. We've created an atomic bomb. We're very clear on how far we can go when we put our energy out into the world. Now, the same can be said for all the beautiful, creative, artistic performance work. Of course, it's wonderful to be in a world with such a rich and diverse choice around how much poetry and plays and films and food we can consume, I guess, or appreciate. But again, there reaches a ceiling. We're overflowing with this version of creative expression. So that creative power, it's seeking to refine and evolve and become even more impactful than it has been in the past. And the natural tendency then is for that focus to turn inwards and kickstart or activate what is called involution. Now, what involution really means is that the way that we would start to use our energy is about cultivating within us as a single human being a certain resourcefulness that allows us to actually participate in our lives from a different vibrational quality. Now, in the present day, many of us are struggling with triggered selves, with wounding patterns. We are not processing our emotions in a really healthy way. Our mental capacity is very obstructed by the quality of our emotional nature. So, what we're thinking is triggering how we're feeling, or how we're feeling is triggering what we're thinking. And then that's actually directing our energy to try and prevent further pain or suffering or discomfort. And that too is another revelation that is really unfolded in this generation or the last couple of generations, that is actually not helpful to control or manage or try to avoid this relationship between mind and emotional nature. In fact, what we want to be able to do is to learn about that interdependency by going through these experiences of healing out of our own triggers. Just like going to boot camp, you actually have to do the work. You have to get fit internally. And that internal fitness and resilience is actually built around gentleness, an appreciation for your emotional nature, the capacity to live as a truly sensitive being, and to ensure that the outer world, the culture, is able to support how deeply sensitive and attuned we are as human beings. And that is, of course, not the case right now. Our cultural environment is extremely frenetic. There's a lot of high stimulus coming in, and that's actually not the way that our natural temperament likes to flow. We are far more peaceful creatures, really. And this species that we are, it has an intelligence around that. So we see this discord between the culture and how it's asking us to channel our energy, and the way that it frames our personal agency, and the kind of experience we're having as a single human being inside this system that asks for our energy to be so exhaustive. People are exhausted. They're getting, sicker in different ways. We're having a lot of mental duress. We have increase in self-harm. These are all symptoms of a human being that is operating at a higher energy momentum than is natural. And it's really easy for us to actually make the shift that we need to. And that is to understand that the external messaging that we're getting about the correct use of our energy and the true nature of our personal agency is limited, narrow, and has many blind spots. And the education that I'm offering you here, that's about waking you up to that truth and having you step back and understand that humanity is already part of a momentum in which an involution is taking place. And the focus of our energy is now no longer to create out there, to channel our power out there, to believe that personal agency is about bringing justice and fairness and equilibrium in a forced way by trying to force systems to wake up. It just doesn't work. And we've seen that happen over the centuries, So what we are asking now is to make that shift internally, to start cultivating a capacity to live free from identification. That is, the self that you identify with and that you channel your energy through and that you exercise your agency with is no longer a tribally conditioned or culturally conditioned or socially conditioned self. And that takes work. That is the work of personal transformation. So this future human will actually exist free from any kind of identification with any type of tribe. Now, a tribe can be a family, it can be a belief, it can be a cultural context for how you should use your energy. It's any belief or self that sees itself belonging to one group and therefore there are others. So you exist in relation to another who is different from you, to the extent that you lose your touch, or your capacity to understand that you are actually all part of a larger system, humanity, and you have a shared humanity. Now, this identification, it is the source of all our suffering right now on the planet. And we see that in war. By exploring humanity's relationship to conflict, to war, we can see very clearly this relationship between identification and violence. So, I often hear on social media these days, people arguing about, who is barbaric in the wars that are currently unfolding across the world, and of course it really depends on which side you sit, who you think the perpetrator is and who the victim is. And, it just shows us that victim and perpetrator dynamic doesn't really get us closer to the truth of why humans behave the way they do. So war in all shapes, forms, contexts over the centuries has achieved one thing, and that is that it creates conditions in which barbaric atrocities occur. And you may believe that if you were in those conditions, you wouldn't behave that way. But time has shown through history, by lived experience, that any human being is capable of atrocities when the conditions are right for it or ripe for it. So war is one of those contexts in which you can be 100% guaranteed that once we engage with and agree to war, what we're really engaging with and agreeing to is creating a set of conditions where atrocities, horror, suffering, and violence will most definitely occur. So you can blame one tribe or another, but we all have that capability. And what we have seen through history is that victims often become perpetrators and perpetrators become victims. So we know that it is a shared human capability to commit such acts. Now, of course, the variance on how severe those acts might be will be different from person to person, depending on their own experiences, the kind of history that their tribes have had. But as long as you are identifying with a group that believes itself to be a victim, there will always be this possibility of another war. So the only real way for humanity to transcend its current relationship to this kind of harm is to actually face this reality or this truth in which we come to understand that war is not an option. War doesn't resolve the kind of issues that we are seeking to resolve, and it will create conditions in which atrocities will happen. And we need to be clear on that. Whether we're participating in the war or simply observing it, we are in some ways agreeing to it if we are not actively doing what we can to prevent it from happening. Now, you may say, well, often the person who is attacked doesn't have any choice. But of course, we do have choices. And maybe we don't know exactly how to respond to a situation like that yet from a higher consciousness. But we can stop, pause, and consider in a very different way how to respond when we are attacked. And this is what we need to start doing in our personal lives. We often feel attacked, under threat, misjudged, misunderstood in our day-to-day lives, at work, at home, in our families, in very small and subtle ways that actually trigger within us a highly defensive energy pattern in which we really would like to attack and often do, but not through violence, more passive-aggressive ways. So we need to start becoming very aware of that happening in our small little lives and to start to develop our capacity to respond to these triggers within ourselves in a more conscious and mature way. And this has always been the role of spirituality and in current time psychology. And I believe there is a spiritual psychology at play here. We are all being asked to do our bit to help humanity evolve out of these really harmful ways that we try to resolve big issues. And it's going to be exciting. It's going to help us restore our energy because we'll no longer be answering to this constant demand to achieve, to perform, to create, to express who we are out in the world. That won't be important as we start to prepare for this new reality that is being born, in which we will relate to each other in a very different way than we are now. It's no longer about pushing out into the world who you are and wanting people to recognize and receive you. We're going to meet in what's called a more Buddhic state. Our auras are going to communicate. We are going to collaborate and cooperate around these big challenges, but not through fear, through genuinely inspired relationships in which we can foresee this vision of a humanity that is moving towards us and start to redirect our energy to support it. Now, what's ironic is I'm actually here creating this content for you, and I create quite a lot of content. So in a way, I'm still expressing outwards, part of that old paradigm. But, these transformations happen over time. So, where I'm at is I'm part of that process of recognizing that the way that I am communicating and producing and creating is really being phased out. However, if I'm still continuing to do it because there's a part of me that is still operating in that old paradigm and is not completely ready for the new way of showing up, that transmutation is underway, but the transfiguration is still a little way off. I'm going to then use this energy and this capacity I have to create content that actually supports this vision that is moving towards me. And I'm no longer going to simply participate in a culture that wants me to keep producing, achieving, creating, and expressing myself from some need to be recognized by my peers or to find an audience. That doesn't really matter when this future human is fully understood. We no longer will need that because we would have healed out of the enmeshment and that wound itself that still feels unmet, unheard, and unrecognized. But we will have done that work internally and no longer seek it out there. And I'm sure that poetry and art and film, it's brought me a lot of joy throughout the years. However, there is a lot of it that is seeking to be recognized, that wants their version of the world to be understood. And it's beautiful. It gives us insight into our shared humanity. But at some point, we need to move on from that and really understand, well, once we do understand what these films, these poems, this artwork, these philosophies are calling our attention towards, our shared humanity, this inner capacity we have for joy, for happiness, for sadness, for grief, for compassion, for forgiveness, for hate, for jealousy, for fear, then where do we want to go with that? And I would say we would want to become masters of our own psyche, understand the architecture of ourself, how the way that we perceive the world, our psychology and the well-being of our psychology really guides the way that our energy moves into the world and has us understand how much agency we really have. Really at this spiritual self, the one in which you are fully aligned with the vision of humanity that is moving towards us. This is where you're going to start to have access to what I would call your highest potential or true authentic agency, because you've redirected that agency into healing, transforming, and liberating your very small conditioned self to allow this authenticity to become more available into the world and in your relationships with other people. So if you find this exciting, but you don't really understand exactly the mechanics of what I'm talking about here, I have been doing a podcast called The Pearl Effect that actually walks you through the operational or mechanical side of personal transformation. So it can help you understand how does this work in practice. Or you can head over to the Higher Life Academy, where I actually have masterclasses that can help you walk this path in a very practical way. So I hope this has been insightful, and until next time, take care and love life.